Hello, everyone. I'm really excited today that we have another guest with our podcast. He is the co-founder of Renaissance Periodization and coached numerous athletes and busy professionals in both their diet and weight training. And he himself is a competitive bodybuilder and a professional Brazilian Jiu Jitsu grappler. Also, he's a professor in strength and hypertrophy master programs at Lehman College, and also he's taught several courses at multiple universities, including nutrition for public health, advanced sports, nutrition and exercise. He's Dr. Mike Israetel, and we are super excited to have him on the podcast. Mike, welcome, and thank you for taking the time to have that conversation.
David, thank you so much for having me on. I'm excited to be on. Thank you.
Great, Mike. Anything else you want to add? Anything we missed in the introduction?
I think you covered a lot of stuff. I think that's pretty good.
Okay, that's good. So today we want to discuss something pretty uh, difficult for some people, and also very important when it comes to strength training and people who are looking to improve their physique. And this is training to failure. Given the fact that we and most of our followers are natural trainers, and very important to know how to approach training to failure. We wanted to have you since we do consider a type of method to use in your trainings and the reps in reserve and the max recoverable volume, all that stuff. It's pretty cool in order to cover that principle of training to failure. So first off, we wanted to give an definition about training to failure, and you to explain what exactly that means about when it comes to training for hypertrophy.
Yeah, that sounds really good. So I think training to failure can be and has been defined in a bunch of different ways, but probably the way that makes the most sense for application is when you reach something called technical failure.
Okay.
That's when you're doing an exercise and you're using good technique, standardized range of motion, no added unintentional momentum or anything like that. And then when you can no longer perform any more repetitions in a single set, trying as hard as you possibly can, but while your technique stays within sort of the constraints of what you consider allowable,
Okay.
then that is something that I would consider technical failure. And in regular conversation, I just call that failure. Because some people will say, well, once you reach technical failure, can't you use a little momentum to keep grinding out reps? You can, but that creates a really big problem that we could talk about either now or some other time.
Yeah. Okay, I believe that covers it pretty well. And when it comes to training to failure in the topic of hypertrophy, we came across a very interesting study from Cameron J. Mitchell. It was from 2012, I believe, where they covered the training to muscle failure, regardless of the load, leads to maximal recruitment of muscle fiber. So that means that no matter where you train with 30% or 80% of your one rep max, if you reach a good technical failure, you should be all good. How do you feel about having that, and primarily like someone decides to focus on light loads only? Do you feel that's practical for hypertrophy?
Yeah, so it's got a couple caveats. Light doesn't mean infinitely light. It means probably something like your 30 rep max, maybe a little bit lighter. And it's not entirely clear in the long term if a method of training exclusively with, let's say, 30 rep maxes, it produces as much sustainable hypertrophy. In a laboratory study, it's pretty straightforward to get people to go to failure or very close with high reps because you have a research team and they're usually yelling at the person and they only have to do it once. When you're trained consistently, if you train very close to failure with high repetitions, a lot of times people won't get as close to failure with very high reps as they do with low reps because the pain starts to be incredible and the nervous system fatigue within the set starts to be really incredible. And that might lead to many people, when they use very high repetitions, to stay actually considerably further away from failure than they would with lower repetitions. Because like set of 8 to failure, then you could try very, very hard, but at some point the bar just kind of stops, and you're not even very discomforted. You're just like, I just can't do anymore. So failure is kind of unequivocal there. With a set of 28, once you do 28, if you just try harder, can you do 29? For a lot of people, the answer is yes. And another potential problem with that is even if the people successfully go very close to failure or to failure with ultra high reps, that might actually cost a little bit more fatigue, specifically psychological and neurological fatigue from having to try that hard to go close to failure. And sort of because you can seem to always be able to do one more rep, you can actually try and hang around at your limits of ability for quite a long time, maybe 3 or 5 whole seconds of grinding, true grinding. Whereas with a max set of 8, for example, it's like a half a second later you realize it's just not going anywhere and the bar's physically falling back onto you. There's not much trying after that. So those are some of the practical considerations, but generally speaking, if you train very hard, close-ish to failure, within 3 or 4 reps away from true technical failure, then yeah, you're going to get very robust results from heavy loads and light loads. Are they identical? We don't know that. Are they identical long-term? We don't know that. Are they identical in the long-term in real, actual people that train? We don't know that. So some pretty serious caveats, but at the very least, we can say that if you're hurt and you can't go heavy for a few months, high rep training will absolutely conserve all of your muscle, and almost certainly you can make very good gains. Can that continue in the long term? There may be some questions to answer before we go saying that.
Oh, great. So purely for practical application, like I don't see anyone like going light all the time, since purely from time perspective, if you decide to go like on any given set doing 30 plus reps, at some point I don't think like mentally if you like can handle like doing all that in order to get into a point where you can engage the muscle to the failure. And like for sure there should be a variety of rep ranges and the intensity used in the practical application. And we covered in some point I had the hypertrophy perspective, but when it comes to strength, and if someone is focused on primarily strength gains, not only hypertrophy, does training to failure has place in their training regimen, or is something they should be staying away from?
So there's an interesting cultural difference between bodybuilders and powerlifters, for example, with regard to failure training. That's our first clue before we even dive into the research and into the technical discussion about maybe something is different between strength and hypertrophy, because not all, but a lot of bodybuilders swear by training to failure. They think it's really great. Almost no powerlifters swear by training to failure. And that may be for a few reasons, but one of the reasons is that powerlifters need to be able to perform consistently, week after week. They need to perform at a high level. They don't just go to the gym and try their hardest and sort of whatever happens, happens, because the stimulus just takes care of itself. Like with bodybuilding, if you just train hard over and over and over, you probably get really good results. With powerlifting or strength training, of which powerlifting is the most known application, you actually need to perform at a certain level every time. So if you bench press 100 kilos for a set of 5 in week 1, you're going to have to bench 102.5 or 105 in week 2, 107.5 or 110 in week 3, and so on. So because you have to perform at a high level sort of repeatedly, fatigue is something that powerlifters are much more cognizant of, strength trainees. And generally speaking, the amount of fatigue you're carrying interferes more with strength training, with the process of strength training, and of course its improvement, than it does with hypertrophy training. And that's actually just a very small part of a larger spectrum in which endurance activity can be trained consistently at the highest levels of cumulative fatigue and still benefit. Hypertrophy training less, strength training less, power training less, and speed or explosiveness training the least, right? So if you're training for speed and you're tired, almost all of your training is complete waste of time, because if you don't go like 95% of your top speed, You just don't get any faster. So scaling back to power and then strength, if you're not hitting planned numbers that are bigger than they were last time or roughly bigger, then you're probably not accomplishing a whole lot. Sure, you're training hard, but there's no more weight on the bar. And since powerlifters and strength trainees really, really deify, really worship how much weight is on the bar, for good reason, they've noticed that if they go to failure or very close to it often with a lot of volume, the next week or several days, their strength is down because of that high level of fatigue. With bodybuilders, the way they train a lot of times is they'll just switch exercises, they'll switch rep ranges. So sometimes that variation prevents the strength decline from even occurring for that specific movement. And another set of times, it actually masks it entirely, because if you don't compare like versus like, if you don't compare leg press for sets of 8 to leg press for sets of 8 next week, you don't even know if you got weaker. So that's one of the reasons that sort of culturally strength trainees have stayed a little bit further away from failure. And we have gathered pretty well from research that strength training, so there's kind of two types of studies that are very popular to do with regards to failure. One is having a group do failure training, having another group do non-failure training, stopping like 2 or 3 reps in reserve and measuring their muscular outcomes, hypertrophy outcomes. Did they grow muscle? Which group grew more? And then another very popular type of study, sometimes these studies are done together, is to see which group got stronger. And on the strength literature, it's been quite clear for a while, non-failure training is probably just better for strength than training to failure. And that is very likely not because training to failure doesn't stimulate strength gains. Well, it probably does the best, but the fatigue cost is so high, it screws up your future training that much more. It's like cooking a meal in your kitchen, but the meal, it's the most delicious meal you can make, but it costs $200 to make, and it leaves your kitchen a gigantic mess. You have to hire cleaning people to clean it for $100 after. And someone says, why don't you cook this meal all the time? And you're like, what are you, an idiot? I don't have $300 on a team of people to clean all the time. That's crazy, right? This is just the same way training to failure may have all these really good benefits, but in a ratio to its fatigue, it's just not sustainable. And look, every now and again, on a very special occasion, you may train to failure to elicit some very, very high-level responses if you have the time and the structure in your program to recover from them. Just like you might, if someone special comes to visit you from another country and you haven't seen them in a long time, maybe you will make that really, really delicious meal for $300. It's not something you do all the time, though, because it's not sustainable. So for strength training specifically, that high fatigue seems to be prohibitive to doing consistent good work. And this is something I discovered myself. I used to train multiple sets to failure in pretty much everything when I was in university, when I was younger. And what I would notice is after about 2 or 3 weeks, I would get much weaker. Like I would lose tons of reps on my sets. And I was like, what the hell is going on? Then I started reading a little bit more. Some of my friends in university were not training to failure, and they were getting really, really strong. And I started to try to train like them, not go to failure anymore. And I just started doing sort of sets of 5 to 8, stopping a few reps shy of failure just when it got hard. And I added 5 pounds to the bar one week, and then 5 pounds the next, 5 pounds the next. After 6 months, I was so much stronger than I had ever been. I was like, oh my God, something you can really, really feel. So I think that's probably my beginning of a good answer for that.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mike. And from training to failure perspective, we covered the definition and that review that was pretty interesting in terms of different intensities and failure and about strength. But let's focus on the hypertrophy perspective now and discuss the pros and cons when it comes to a natural trainee training to failure when it comes to hypertrophy. What can you, and from your practice and experience with clients and yourself, define as the pros and cons of training to failure?
Yeah, there's a couple pros of training to failure. One, you get the best possible hypertrophic stimulus in any one given session. So flat out, it's the best way to train as far as getting muscle growth for one time. Another benefit is it allows you to have an objective marker for knowing you're training hard enough. Okay, if you're going to failure, very few people can say that at least when you do each set that you do, that you're not going hard enough. So you can't move the bar anymore. You have 99 problems, but training relative effort is probably just not one of them. Maybe you're not doing enough volume. Maybe your frequency is too low. Your exercise selection, maybe there's a bunch of other stuff going on, but you sure as hell are, when you're training hard enough. And that's a big deal. Some people don't try hard enough, and if they never approach failure, they may never know. And lastly, on a related point, because failure is absolute, it can be used as a relative benchmark to make sure that you're training hard enough chronically, even if you don't all the time approach failure. So for example, as a way that I personally train and advocate that many other people train of hypertrophy is to start with maybe like 2 or 3 reps in reserve, maybe 4 reps in reserve at the beginning of a mesocycle with a certain exercise and a certain set and rep scheme. And then every week they add a little bit of load or add a repetition here and there. And the goal is to just add load and repetitions, usually for kind of as long as you can, until you're not able to hit these progressive PRs, you're not able to hit these personal records, you're not able to get any more muscular endurance or strength. Because when you're not able to get them anymore, it probably means your fatigue is very high, and it probably means you're not really overloading maximally anymore, and it probably means you're not getting much out of training or as much as you used to. And it's kind of time to say, okay, I'm very tired. I can't get stronger anymore. Time to take a break, maybe rework some things and come back. Now, here's the thing. If you train like that, let's say you start at what you think is 3 or 4 reps in reserve, and you train for 2 months straight. You add a rep every other time, add 2.5 kilos every other time, and you just keep getting stronger, doing more reps, but you never hit failure. When do you deload? Well, why would you deload? You're still getting stronger. Apparently that's fine. Now maybe you have some aches and pains, maybe you feel tired, but maybe those aches and pains and that tiredness is just a part of what hard training is about, right? Like when you get tired on a long road trip in a car, you don't just pull over. You're on a road trip. It's okay to get a little bit tired. So maybe having something like, an odometer on your car that tells you how far you've gone, you say, okay, it's 600 kilometers. We're going to take a break. Just the same way, when you're training over and over for weeks and weeks and weeks, if your performance is going up, probably you shouldn't stop. At least it's a good idea to consider to keep going. Now, when you hit eventually true muscular failure, and at that failure point you can no longer get stronger, then you did as much as you possibly could. You really do need a deload because you truly are fatigued in the literal sense that you cannot recover from training, because recovery implies a return to past performance or an improvement in performance. And that way you safely can look back at your mesocycle and say, I trained as long and as hard as I possibly could to get the most muscle growth out, and now I'm not getting any more progress. I know. But if you never train to failure, ever, how do you know you're not always more reps in reserve than you thought? In addition to that, we know that if you drop your reps in reserve too high, so for example, 5 or 6 reps in reserve, we have a few studies to suggest to us that the training is suboptimal at that point. You're not getting your best results with that far from failure. But if you never really go to failure ever, how do you know you weren't always at 5 or 6 reps in reserve? Maybe you were. And you could say, well, no, I really feel like I'm not. Well, how do you know? You've never pushed yourself and found out. This is particularly interesting because there is some research that was done actually by Eric Helms and his team in New Zealand, and summarized very well by them in later work, that a lot of times, especially beginner lifters, are really wildly off of how far from failure they think they were. Now, it's not everyone, but there are a large handful of people that think they're close to failure, like a rep or two, and they're really like 6 or 8 reps away from failure. You don't want to be one of these people. And the only way to know for sure is occasionally at least get to going to actual failure.
Yeah, I've come across those studies, and actually when asking those people really to reach failure, they'd be doing like 8 to 10 reps more with that specific weight on the bar, which is ridiculous, and people should definitely rethink if they are that close to failure that they think that is actually what they're reporting.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and you specify the pros, and what about the cons? What do you? They're kind of obvious, but again, we want you to cover them since
Sure,
it's
sure.
important for people to know what training to failure on a consistent basis might lead to.
Yeah. So, I guess, well, um, one of the just real quick on the pros,
Okay.
because training to failure in any one session gives you the most possible muscle growth, there may be a point where you become so advanced that anything less than the best effort you're capable of may give you undetectable or no gains at all. So maybe when you become really high level, you've been training for 15 years consistently and super hard and well, it might be the situation that getting closer to failure more often or to
Mm-hmm.
failure may be the kind of the only thing that grows you. We have at least one literature review done recently by Brad Schoenfeld and his team that actually supports that idea to some extent. They showed that failure training was actually more efficacious in advanced people than it was relative to not going to failure in beginners. So we do have some ideas about that. So that's a potential benefit. It doesn't apply to most people, but it's definitely something you have to consider. And the way you would consider this is, let's say you've been training, with reps in reserve, rarely going to failure, and
Mm-hmm.
you've been doing that for 12 years, and your gains have really slowed down or kind of stopped. I would pull that failure card out of the bag and try to play it. I would design a program which goes on average closer to failure than you're used to, maybe towards the end of the mesocycle, even going beyond failure with forced reps and drop sets and stuff like that, and see if you get any more growth. You may be pleasantly surprised. So it's not something to rule out. So just another pro, because that's
Yep.
an implication of the failure training probably brings the best results in any one session, but it's important to draw it out entirely. So the cons. Failure training really only has one big con. Now, a small con of failure training is that failure, going to failure, very close to it, tends to destabilize technique, at least to some extent.
Okay.
And by that mechanism, it may cause an increase in injury. This is something that you can see if you've been training for a long time, especially if you're really big and strong. Really getting close to failure with heavy loads feels weird. And you don't really feel like you're 100% in control of the motion anymore because most of your effort has left from keeping the mechanics as tidy as possible and been pushed into just moving the weight. And when that happens, some muscles that maybe aren't used to being recruited for that start to get recruited. For example, on the leg press, when you get real close to failure, I tend to notice that for many people, their adductors tend to start to activate a little bit more than usual, not just their quads. I mean, your body's trying to use everything it can to move the weight. And in my experience, that tends to escalate the risk of injury at least somewhat, right? So, let's say aliens came down and they put a gun to your head and said, "We want you to pick your one set of leg press that you're going to do. You can either go 5 reps in reserve at this 110 kilo leg press,
Okay.
or you can go to true failure. And if you get injured on this set, we're going to destroy you and the earth. But if you don't get injured, everything's fine, and we'll give you guys $250 in alien technology." Anyone who says, "Oh, I'll just go to failure," is just a stark raving idiot, right? Like, so at the end of the day, and it might be a tiny difference, but you're in the gym all the time and not being injured is important to you. You probably at least want to know when you're risking a slight injury risk to at least be in charge of that and make a known trade-off. So that's something I think is worth mentioning, that there's probably a little bit of an injury difference. Now, the biggest downside to failure training is not the injury stuff, it is the fatigue stuff.
Okay.
So failure training, by mostly factors not related to muscle damage, mostly by nervous system factors, specifically psychology, fatigues you like crazy. There is a prior established base of theory and research onto how relative effort scales with fatigue, and it's usually exponentially. That is, the closer and closer you get to trying your absolute very hardest, it's not like the more and more fatigue you get, it's the more and more and more fatigue you get in a scaled manner that gets really out of hand really quick. For example, it's been the fatigability of marathon runners has been studied very extensively and observed by tens of thousands of runners. And almost every runner will say, they'll run training runs that are as long or longer than their competition races, maybe like a marathon. They'll run it at times that are like maybe 2 or 3% off of their competition times, a really hard training session. Typically, they report a little bit of soreness, a bit of fatigue. It's hard. Within a few days, they're back to normal, right? After a big race, where again, objectively, they only do like 2 or 3% more relative effort. I mean, like the time decreases by a few seconds for each mile. They report being crushed for a week afterwards. Crazy delayed onset soreness. There's a very good established literature on massive susceptibility being sick right after you give a max effort in competition like that. So a lot of people literally just get a cold or even a mini flu right after they compete at a high level in endurance sport. And for a long time, it was just very confusing. Why? It's not that hard. Well, it turns out the emotional, the psychological, the neurological difference between 97% effort and 100% effort is huge. So it's very, very likely to be similar in weight training. And those of us who have trained before, there's two groups of people. People who admit that training to failure is incredibly psychologically costly, and people that are wrong, right? So it's just something you intuitively know. Now, as a proponent of failure training, you may say, look, I know it's higher fatigue, but it's worth the trade-off. That is a fine position to hold. But the fatigue is massive, and now we can talk about the real downside here. By itself, fatigue's not a downside. Look, training is supposed to be hard, so what the hell? Shut up, Get the fatigue, get the gains. The thing is, there's at least two levels on which that becomes a problem. First, for the vast majority of trainees, literature has illustrated that you at best, can't tell apart the gains of people that stop 2 or 3 reps in reserve from those that go to failure. Okay. So, and at worst, people that stop 2 or 3 reps in reserve actually get better gains. So at best, there's no difference for most people in most situations. You think, okay, well then there's no difference, right? But the fatigue is higher, which means problem number one, if you do 4 sets of bench press to failure, you may accrue as much cumulative fatigue as someone who does 6 or 7 sets of bench press to 2 reps in reserve. And because almost every study that compares results of failure and non-failure training is volume equated, what that means is the person who does 6 or 7 sets versus 4, if we equate fatigue instead of volume, that person grows much more muscle. We know from tons of other literature that within 1 session for the average trainee, going from 1 set close to failure or failure, all the way up to right around 8 to 10 sets, scales the stimulus more and more and more. So in one given session, you're probably going to grow quite a bit more muscle if you do 8 sets versus if you do 6 or 4 or 2 and so on and so forth. So if you're training to failure, and so we've experienced this before. I mean, if you sit down on the leg press and you're like, I'm going to do sets. If you go to failure, true failure, man, 3 sets of leg press later, you're like done. Like you can't try very hard because you're just cooked. Your fatigue is skyrocketed. Now, if you try another workout, same loads, similar reps, but stop 2 or 3 reps short of failure, after 3 sets, you're going to be like, dude, I can keep going. I can do another 2-3 sets, no problem. Now, 2-3 sets later, you're cooked, but you got 2 or 3 sets more of hypertrophic stimulus. That's just in 1 session. So that's a big problem. My friends and I, Jared and Charlie, my training partners, we post our sessions on Instagram and on YouTube. And a lot of times people ask, like, why did you stop at like whatever number of reps? You look like you had more in the tank. And the reason is like, well, we're here, we have to do more sets still. And doing more sets is a way more dependable way of getting more growth than going closer to failure. It's not even up for debate. So that's problem number one. Within any given session, if you do all the sets to failure and you do just as many sets, sure, you can get more growth by a little bit training to failure. But how many sets you can productively do is a function of how fatigued you are. And if you're not very fatigued, it's easy to do more sets. Now, that's the first problem. It's not a very big problem because you can just grip your own balls in your hand and just do more to failure. Come on, nut up. You're a grown man or a grown woman. You got to do what it takes. Fine. But here's the problem, the bigger problem. Problem number two. Fatigue accumulates. If you're training at an appropriate frequency and volume, I'll just give quick guidelines: 4 to 10 sets per muscle group per session, 2 to 4 sessions per muscle group per week. Like, not an insane amount, just a regular amount. If you train that frequently and that hard, fatigue accumulates no matter what. So you have to deload at least every few months, sometimes much more frequently if you're bigger and stronger and have worse recovery, so on and so forth. If you go to failure, the number of workouts you can string together in which your cumulative fatigue is not yet so high as to make you weaker and unable to continue without a deload shrinks by a huge factor. If I went right now in my current program to true failure in every single workout with a certain number of sets, I would probably last about 2.5 weeks until I wasn't hitting PRs anymore. My fatigue was unreal. I wasn't sleeping well. My appetite was gone. And I just like, it's time to deload because at a molecular level, catabolism is now prevailing over anabolism. Okay. If, however, I keep my reps in reserve normal, I can last 4 weeks, no problem. Man, that's a 1.5 weeks more of gains. And I always deload a week anyway. Over the course of an entire year, I mean, you're growing like 25 or 30% more each year if you don't train to failure all the time, because failure demands that you either lower your volume a lot or lower your accumulation to deload paradigm. You can't train for as long. And what you see with people, high-level bodybuilders, is oftentimes their volume isn't that high if they're dedicated to training to failure. So, a lot of bodybuilders that train to failure will do 1 set per exercise and then 1 drop set or down set, and then they'll move on and they'll only do maybe a few hard working sets per session. And sometimes they only train muscle groups 1 time a week. Well, that's a pretty good way of showing off, but they could squeeze in more sets, probably get more growth, definitely more sessions, which is way more growth, if they stop short of failure. And that really is the big kicker. Now, for super elite, super strong bodybuilders, especially very super fast twitch, maybe for them, that coming close to failure now at the very later end of their career pays bigger dividends than doing a bunch of submaximal volume, possibly. But for most people who follow these bodybuilders, you're not in their shoes. You don't have to do that. You can just get away with training normally and getting amazing results. And then if that doesn't work anymore, maybe you can play with failure later.
Great. Yeah, for sure. And we need to adjust based on our own individuals. And as you said, we are not in those bodybuilder shoes. So should consider that and make sure that we adjust the variables in our training accordingly so we can progressively get stronger and progress over time. It's not like something we do in a month. If we're dedicated to training and want to improve, that should last years.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Great. And is there anything else from Con's perspective you want to cover, Mike?
Man, I can say that training to failure for people that are very new to training can degrade technique and make them learn bad technique because they're practicing in a very high fatigue state, both acutely and over the long term. Yep. That can be obviated, which is why I didn't want to just mention it as a con much at all or without a big caveat. That can be obviated just by dedicating yourself to really strict technique. It's possible to fail with strict technique, but it's just much easier for advanced people to do that. So with beginners especially, I think failure training is wholly pointless because it has almost all the cons and almost none of the pros.
Yes, great. And having all that said, and based on our discussion, I believe that we can make a summary in a nutshell, give some practical applications. You covered some of those in the discussion that starting in the mesocycle, we should like keep shy from failure and have some reps in reserve, and then moving forward into the macrocycle, we can just limit the number of reps we have in reserve. But in general, if you can just give some practical applications to people, how to approach training to failure and how to add that to their training program.
Sure. So I think for beginners, people training up to 2 to 3 years consistently, I think no failure training at all is perfect. I think those folks should be focused mostly on sets of 5 to 10 reps and increasing the load progressively over time. That should be very easy for them because putting load on the bar in a slow manner is the easiest thing in the world when you just started out. And those folks should deload not when they've hit failure and can't increase performance. They should deload when their bar velocity really starts to slow down, and keeping the reps the same while adding load is starting to get real tough. They're getting tired, and they notice their technique in the last few reps or sets is starting to get a little shaky, because for them, technique perfection is huge. So for beginners, especially folks coached by people, like if I'm coaching a beginner, I stop their sets as soon as I start seeing some shakiness, or maybe give them one more repetition to try to fix it. But if they can't, we stop. And if that happens a few sessions in a row and they're like, oh, I'm really beat up, I'm really tired, deload. So don't go to failure at all. When you're intermediate, roughly 3 to 6 or 3 to 7 years of consistent hard training, you can start at 3 reps in reserve or something like that. Add a little bit of weight, add a little bit of repetitions every session, more or less, and then you deload when you hit failure. And you hit failure only with very, very good technique, and really try hard, really push the envelope. Some week you might be like, oh, that was really close to failure, maybe I should deload. Try another week. You may be surprised. You may hit quote unquote failure again, but with 5 more pounds. Try another week. I would say intermediates are very, very well served by actually training so hard every mesocycle that they see a slight dip in their performance. Like really knowing how to push your limits, because they'll have no problem recovering, deload, they supercompensate, everything's great. For advanced folks, they might start off maybe with 2 or 3 reps in reserve, sometimes even 1 or 2. Their technique should be perfect. Their mind-muscle connection should be really, really, really powerful. They're not just grinding. They're using their pecs or using their quads or using their triceps, whatever it is they're targeting, to create the grind, not just moving weight, because at that point, it's the specificity is very poor, the fatigue is very high. And for them, they may try to approach failure very closely, and potentially in the last week of training before a deload, what they can do is have someone on the machines and exercises, which is conducive, help them do some forced reps afterwards, or do some kind of mini drop reps or something like that. And then they can be sure they're pushing to their true best. However, as an individual trying to seek the best performance, as a high-level person, I wouldn't advise that method. I would just advise the intermediate method until and unless the intermediate method is bringing you very few results. And for that advanced method, I can't guarantee it'll work because it's all theoretical, and it may actually work worse than the intermediate method, but it's definitely something to try at some point.
Great. That's pretty good advice, and hopefully people get the most of them, and based on what and everything else we discussed so far will be beneficial for them to improve their training and to get the best results they can. And given everything we already discussed and touch bases on, is there anything else you want to
add? No, I think just, failure training is an interesting concept. It's a very useful tool. If you've never been to failure before and you consider yourself an intermediate, it's time to acquaint yourself. But I would just advise people not to, again, to deify failure. I wouldn't advise people to put it on a pedestal. Like it's this amazing thing. A lot of people use it as a badge of honor. Like I went to failure. I tried really hard. That's cool. But, we're here to get the maximum effect, not necessarily to try super hard. Yeah, trying super hard is great if it gets you the max effect, not at the expense of a maximum effect.
Great. That's a great conclusion to our conversation, Mike. And I want to thank you again for taking the time and for providing all that great information. Again, I will repeat myself, but I do know that it will be super helpful for our followers, and they get the time to hear that conversation, will get the benefit, and it for sure improve their training and get better results moving forward.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me on.
It was a pleasure for us, Mike. Thanks again.
All righty. Take care.
You too.